4 fragile lives abandoned like yesterday's trash. No shelter, no water, no mercy. A mother German shepherd and her 3 newborn pups left to die beneath the burning sun of Ember Trail. No one came. No one cared. Until a lone officer heard the silence and chose to answer it. Jake Bennett didn't expect a call from the forest to change his life. But what he found wasn't just a rescue. It was redemption. For them. And for him. What happened next will restore your faith in love, loyalty, and the quiet heroes who never stop trying. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe every mother deserves safety, and every soul deserves a second chance, hit that subscribe button. Because this story will stay in your heart long after the screen goes dark. The late autumn wind whispered through the pine needles of Ember Trail, tugging at the crumbling leaves and painting the forest floor in a golden mosaic. The Oregon sky was gray and close, the air thick with the smell of wet bark and distant rain, and the occasional caw of a raven echoed like a warning between the trees. No tourists came this deep into the Ember Valley Reserve anymore, just silence, fog, and forgotten things. A rusted green pickup rumbled down the narrow dirt path, its tires spitting gravel and mud as it veered off the main trail. The driver was a man in his mid-40s, unremarkable in appearance but with eyes too still. His name was Wade Colburn, a once friendly face around town, now hunched and sallow-cheeked, the result of too many wrong turns and a dwindling business-breeding German shepherds in his unlicensed backyard kennel. A short, stocky man with a nervous twitch in his left eye, Wade had the look of someone constantly waiting to be caught. Life had not made him cruel, but indifference had made him empty. He pulled the truck to a stop and shut off the engine. For a moment, the forest held its breath. Wade stepped out, glanced over both shoulders, then opened the tailgate. A wooden crate-old, splintered, stained sat wedged in the back, its edges bound with rope. Something moved inside, and a faint whimper escaped the gaps between the slats. Wade didn't flinch. He grunted, dragged the crate to the edge, and let it drop onto the forest floor with a dull, final thud. He didn't look down. He climbed back into his truck, started the engine, and drove off without a backward glance, his tires kicking up the first whispers of mist behind him. Inside the crate, a thin, bone-tired German shepherd curled her body tightly around her 3 newborns. Her name, though she didn't know it yet, was Sierra. Her fur was once thick and gold amber, but now it was dulled with grime, patchy from overbreeding, and matted with traces of blood. Her ribs jutted sharply against her skin. Her left ear was torn at the tip, a memory from her last desperate escape attempt. She was 4 years old, but her eyes were ancient, filled with something older than pain. Quiet resignation. Sierra licked each of her pups in turn. 3 small, sightless bundles of vulnerability. One whimpered, another shivered, and the smallest made no sound at all. The forest around them was deafening in its indifference. No food, no water, no cover, just cold earth, creeping fog, and the smell of abandonment. Still, Sierra did not move. She wrapped herself tighter around her children and pressed her nose to their backs. She had been denied warmth, safety, and rest, but she would not deny it to them. Not while she still had breath. At the same time, a few miles north of the trail, Officer Jake Bennett was making his way through a different part of the reserve. 32, tall and lean with close-cropped dark blonde hair and eyes the color of riverstone, Jake was a patrol officer with the county sheriff's department. A former Marine turned local lawman, he wore his uniform like a second skin practical, dusted with pine pollen and slightly faded at the collar. His demeanor was quiet, watchful. Those who knew him described him as dependable but distant. And it was true. Something in his past had taught him to be gentle with others, but never soft with himself. Today, he was following up on a report of illegal logging in the southern quadrant of Ember Valley. The complaints had been vague, strange tire tracks, missing trees, but he took them seriously. Jake had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had learned the hard way to trust his instincts. Trouble never announced itself loudly. As he maneuvered his patrol SUV through the winding trail, his radio crackled faintly, but nothing urgent came through. He paused near a break in the trees where moss-covered stumps hinted at recent human interference. He stepped out, scanning the clearing. The air was colder here, heavy with the damp of an approaching storm. But there was no sound, no chainsaws, no motion, just forest. Jake crouched beside a stump and brushed away the sawdust. Fresh, he muttered. Whoever did this had been here recently. He marked the GPS coordinates and turned to head back, unaware that less than 2 miles south, Sierra was lying in a crate, her pups huddled against her belly, waiting for something, anything, to change. As the sun began to sink behind the hills, the cold deepened. Sierra's breathing grew slower, and the smallest pup made a noise, a sharp, weak gasp. Sierra nudged him with her nose, licking his ears, her eyes pleading with a world that had never answered. The trail had gone quiet again, and Jake, unaware of what lay just beyond the next curve, started his vehicle and drove away. Night gave way to a pale dawn, casting Ember Trail in a dull blue hue. Mist rolled low over the forest floor, and the skeletal branches of Douglas firs loomed overhead like silent witnesses. The box lay still beneath a shallow incline, pressed halfway into a ditch now softened by damp earth. Inside, Sierra no longer shivered. Her body had gone beyond the tremors of cold into the stillness of exhaustion. One of her pups, the smallest, had stopped nursing and lay slack against her belly. She nudged it weakly, then again, but it did not stir. Sierra's mind, clouded by fatigue and pain, drifted through fragments of memory. There had been other crates, other cold floors, barking, always barking, the air thick with ammonia, the flashing of bare bulbs above her as men dragged her from one pen to the next. She had once been prized, good hips, fine coat, big litter potential. Words tossed around by a man with a cigarette hanging from his lips and a crooked trucker cap. That man had been Dwight Kramer, a large-shouldered, red-faced breeder in his 50s, known for his short temper and the constant smell of motor oil on his jacket. His compound had been a grim backyard operation hidden behind rusted gates on the edge of Silverton County. To him, dogs were investment tools. When they stopped producing, they stopped mattering. Sierra's last litter had come too soon after the previous one. Her body had not recovered. The third pup in that batch had been stillborn. Dwight had cursed, slammed a crate shut, and given her half-rotted leftovers for dinner. Then, a week later, she was hauled into Wade Colburn's truck with 3 fragile newborns and left to fate. Now, in the forest, Sierra's tongue was cracked from thirst. Her eyes crusted over with discharge. But instinct ruled her still. When the tiniest pup wheezed barely a whisper, Sierra drew it closer with what strength remained. There was no one coming. Only the woods. Only the end. Miles away, in a one-room surveillance outpost tucked inside the northern edge of Ember Valley, Lyle Hartman, a junior technician with the State Forestry Service, yawned into his coffee. Lyle was in his late 20s, lanky and pale, with a mop of light brown hair that fell into his eyes, and a nervous, boyish energy. He wasn't a field guy. He preferred screens and solitude, but he took his drone monitoring shift seriously, especially during burn season. That morning, he was reviewing footage from a heat-detecting drone that had made an unscheduled pass over Sector 12, near the edge of the ridge. At first glance, the footage showed nothing unusual. Then something moved barely a flicker along a path of flattened grass. He zoomed in. A wooden crate, a faint signature of life. Lyle frowned, leaning closer. Was that fur? He clicked for infrared. Several small heat spots, one barely registering. "Oh, man," he whispered. Without hesitation, he picked up his phone and called an old contact. Officer Jake Bennett had barely finished his second cup of morning coffee when his phone buzzed. He recognized the name immediately. Lyle Hartman, a former Eagle Scout and drone hobbyist he'd once helped rescue during a solo winter trek gone wrong. Jake answered with a dry, "Tell me you're not stuck in a snowbank again." "No, but you'll want to see this," Lyle said, urgency bleeding through his usual sarcasm. "I got thermal hits near Trail 12. Looked like a crate, and something alive." Jake's expression darkened. He wasn't on duty, but he stood without hesitation. "Send the coordinates. I'll go." As he grabbed his patrol jacket, Jake's mind flickered to the scene he'd left the day before. Something about that trail hadn't sat right. He'd chalked it up to the logging disturbance, but now a different tension gripped his chest. Meanwhile, Sierra stirred at the sound of distant crows. The weak pup was barely breathing. Her limbs screamed for rest. She pushed her snout toward a thin crack in the crate, where faint daylight filtered in. Her body was done, but her will remained. Not far from her location, a fox paused in its foraging, nose twitching toward the scent of decay and milk. It crept closer, eyes glinting, but then a stronger gust of wind scattered its courage. The crate remained untouched. Back in town, Jake radioed in his unofficial detour. "I'm checking a welfare concern off Trail 12. No backup needed unless I call it." Dispatch confirmed and clicked off. The patrol car's tires spat up gravel as he made his way along the twisting access path. His gaze darted between trees, alert now in a way he hadn't been the day before. He slowed near the ridge, checking GPS. Then he saw it, deep gouge marks in the dirt where a heavy object had been dragged. Jake parked and followed the faint trail on foot, his boots crunching through frost-bitten leaves. The air smelled of moss, but beneath it was something fainter. Rot. Animal. Then there it was, the crate, still, silent. Jake approached slowly, kneeling beside it. The slats were smeared with mud and what looked like dried blood. A low whimper came from inside. Carefully he peered through a crack. Sierra blinked up at him. Jake knelt in the brittle underbrush, the cold dampness of the forest floor seeping into his jeans as he peered through the cracks of the crate. The air was sharp with rot and fur. Inside, the German shepherd lay still, her emaciated frame curled protectively around three tiny bodies. Her chest rose and fell in uneven bursts. One pup barely moved. Another whimpered weakly. The mother's amber eyes met his, and in them, Jake saw not fear, but the last flicker of defiance. He spoke softly, his voice low and firm, the way he used to speak to his old K9 partner. "It's okay, girl. I see you." Slowly he removed his jacket and laid it gently beside the crate. Then, inch by inch, he opened the front panel. The mother stirred. She let out a low growl, the sound more breath than sound. Her body tensed, shielding her pups with what strength she had left. But as Jake reached toward her, not to grab, just to offer, she did something unexpected. She didn't bite, she didn't run. She blinked once, then rested her head back down. Jake moved with quiet purpose. His hands were calloused but careful. He placed the smallest pup into the crook of his jacket, then the next, and finally the third. They were feather-light, trembling, and cold. He wrapped them inside the jacket, close to his chest. Next came the mother. Jake hesitated for only a second. She was heavier than she looked, bones beneath sagging skin, but her breath was barely audible. He cradled her against him, careful not to jar her ribs. As he stood, she let out a faint sigh, as if surrendering the burden to someone else, just this once. By the time he reached the cruiser, the first drops of rain were falling. A slow drizzle turned the trail into slick mud as Jake eased into the driver's seat, pups in his lap, and the mother curled in a blanket on the passenger side. The heat blasted on. The wipers beat steadily, and the silence between them pulsed like a heartbeat. As the vehicle bounced back onto the main road, Jake's gaze flicked toward the rearview mirror, and just like that, he was pulled backward through time. He remembered Ranger, his old K-9 partner, large and jet black, with a scar across his left hip and a bark that could freeze any suspect in place. They had been inseparable for 4 years, through narcotics busts, rescue missions, even the night when Ranger had dragged Jake from a crumbling stairwell after a meth lab explosion. Ranger hadn't survived the second blast. Jake had never forgiven himself for calling him back in. Now, glancing at the frail shepherd beside him, her body rising and falling with every ragged breath, something inside Jake cracked wide open. He drove faster. The road twisted through old-growth pines, the canopy above a blur of motion and shadow. Each bump in the asphalt made the smallest pup twitch. Jake adjusted the jacket tighter around them, his left hand gripping the wheel, right arm cradling fragile lives that hadn't yet tasted safety. The nearest rescue center was 30 minutes out, a no-kill shelter with a small triage wing. Jake had been there once, years ago, to drop off an abandoned beagle. It wasn't fancy, but the staff were good people. He tapped his radio. "Dispatch, this is Bennett. I'm en route to Evergreen Rescue. No backup needed. I've got 4 canine lives in need of emergency care." His voice didn't shake, but his knuckles were white. At the edge of town, headlights cut through the fog. Jake pulled into the gravel lot behind the clinic just as a woman stepped out the front door, her long coat flapping in the wind. Dr. Ellie Green, early 30s, compact and composed, with sharp eyes behind black-rimmed glasses. Her dark auburn hair was tied into a messy braid that swung behind her like a whip when she walked. She was the kind of woman who didn't waste words or energy. Former Army vet tech, now full-time rescue veterinarian. Ellie had seen too much, stitched too many wounds, both in animals and in people. She squinted through the rain as Jake opened the cruiser door. "What happened?" she asked, already pulling on gloves. "Found them dumped off Ember Trail," Jake said, handing her the jacket first. 3 pups, a mother. She's not responsive." Ellie didn't blink. She took the bundle and turned to shout inside. "Danny, heat packs and oxygen masks now." Then to Jake, "Bring her in, room 2. We'll get IV started." Jake carried Sierra into the fluorescent-lit building, her weight sinking deeper into his arms with each step. The warmth inside was a shock after the rain. The hallway outside exam room. 2 smelled faintly of iodine and warm towels. The morning had broken fully now, light spilling through the frosted windows of Evergreen Rescue's back wing. Sierra lay curled on a fleece pad inside a heated recovery kennel, the soft hum of an IV pump clicking beside her. Her breathing had stabilized, though still shallow, and her ribs rose with each slow, deliberate breath. One paw twitched now and then, like her body couldn't decide whether to fight or surrender. The 3 pups lay in a smaller incubator unit just a few feet away, their fragile forms nestled together in a nest of soft cloths and fleece. They had been cleaned, weighed, and swaddled. Their tiny bellies rose and fell in rhythm, now still weak, but alive. Jake leaned against the wall, arms crossed, His uniform shirt was damp from sweat and the earlier rain, but he hadn't changed. There were darker smudges under his eyes now. He hadn't said much since they'd arrived hours earlier, only gave short nods and kept his eyes on the door like a soldier waiting for news from the front. Ellie stepped into the hallway, tugging off her gloves. A smudge of antiseptic streaked her jawline, but she didn't seem to notice. Her voice was calm, but her shoulders sagged slightly. "She's stable," she said, "still very dehydrated. And I won't lie, Luna's hanging on by a thread. But the fluids are helping. They all made it through the night. That's something." Jake exhaled softly, the tension in his back easing only a fraction. "Good," he said. Then after a pause, "They deserve names." Ellie tilted her head. "You have some in mind?" He nodded. "That one?" he said, pointing through the glass to the largest of the three, whose paws twitched even in sleep. "Bear. He's the biggest, but seems gentle." She smirked. Appropriately ironic. Jake smiled faintly. "The curious one, always crawling over the other two? That's Scout." "Fitting," Ellie said, watching the second pup stir and nose toward the incubator's side. Jake's gaze dropped to the smallest pup, barely larger than his palm, fur paler than the others, curled tight against her siblings. "And her Luna. She's quiet. But she's still here." Ellie didn't respond for a moment, then nodded. "Luna it is." With a few keystrokes on the intake tablet, she entered the names. Then she turned toward Jake, her voice shifting slightly. "It's been a long time, Jake." He met her eyes now, really looking for the first time. 10 years. 9, she corrected. "Since that convoy in Ramadi?" He gave a slow nod. "You saved my arm. I remember. And you carried me through 40 meters of open ground while bullets chewed up the concrete behind us," she replied dryly. "Call it even." Jake smiled at that, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Didn't expect to find you here." "I figured I'd do less damage patching up dogs," she said, brushing her braid over her shoulder. "They don't lie. They don't freeze under pressure. And they don't break your heart the same way." Jake said nothing. The silence between them was thick but not uncomfortable, like two people used to standing still in the storm. Inside the kennel, Sierra stirred. Her eyes blinked open, unfocused at first, then sharper as the light shifted. She tried to lift her head, failed, then let it fall gently against the fleece. Ellie noticed and stepped in quietly. She opened the latch and knelt beside her, placing a hand on the side of her neck, checking pulse and hydration. "You're tougher than you look, Mama," she murmured. Sierra's ears flicked. Jake stood in the doorway. "Will she make it?" Ellie nodded slowly. "If she doesn't catch infection, and if her body gets a break." "Can she see the pups?" "Not yet," Ellie replied. "They need warmth. She needs rest, but soon." As she closed the kennel door, the entry bell chimed faintly from the lobby. Danny, a stocky teenager with freckles and oversized scrubs, peeked down the hallway. Danny was the clinic's weekend volunteer, sweet-natured, easily flustered, but kind with every creature that passed through the doors. He rubbed the back of his neck. There's a lady up front. Donated blankets. Said she saw the story online. Wants to help." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Already?" Ellie sighed. "Welcome to the internet age. One picture and a name and the world shows up." Jake glanced back at Sierra, then the pups. "Good. Let them come." He sat beside the incubator again, watching Bear shift in his sleep, one paw draped protectively over Luna. Scout was already snuffling the corner of the unit, determined to escape. Ellie stepped beside him. "They'll be okay," she said, "but they're going to need you." Jake looked at her, surprised. "Why me?" She shrugged. "Because when Sierra looked up at you in that crate, she didn't flinch. That's not random." He said nothing, just nodded. As the sun rose higher outside the shelter, its light touched the silver nameplate on the kennel's front. It read, "Sierra, 4 years, shepherd, survivor." The morning light crept gently across the linoleum floor of Evergreen Rescue's east wing, painting long golden stripes across the kennels. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and boiled rice, mixed with the unmistakable scent of fur and new life. Outside, the fog that had blanketed Ember Trail for a week had finally lifted, giving way to a crisp blue sky that held the promise of spring, even if it was still technically winter. Birds chirped near the tree line, and for the first time in days, the world felt less heavy. Sierra stood near the back gate of the fenced play yard, her paws tentative on the soft grass. Her gait was still uneven, her ribs still too visible, but she walked. Each step was a small rebellion against what had nearly ended her. A patch on her left hind leg had been shaved for ivy insertion, and a line of pink scar tissue trailed down her belly signs of both birth and rescue. But her eyes, once dull and hollow, now held something that looked suspiciously like awareness. Jake sat on the bench nearby, notebook in hand, a thermos of black coffee at his side. His hair was slightly longer now, curling above his collar, and he had traded the uniform shirt for a worn flannel and faded jeans. In the sunlight, the lines around his eyes softened. He scribbled notes as he observed Sierra, murmuring dates and words under his breath. "February 11th, he wrote. "Sierra walked 6 full steps today without assistance. Stood when called. Tail wagged twice when I sat down." It had started as something practical, tracking recovery patterns, like he'd done during field reports in the military. But over time, it became something else. A ritual. A way to measure not just Sierra's healing, but his own. He hadn't told anyone about the nightmares that had returned after Ranger's death. The memory of hot smoke, the pop of shrapnel, the way his partner had limped before collapsing in the rubble. But something about Sierra, the way she clung to life for the sake of her pups, taught him that grief could bend without breaking. Inside the building, Luna, Scout, and Bear had grown rapidly under Ellie's watch. They were 6 weeks old now, still clumsy, ears half flopped, but strong. Bear had a lazy charm, always the last to wake up and the first to cuddle. Scout was the instigator, often the reason the bedding ended up in a heap. And Luna, small and serious, watched everything before acting, often curling beside the window when Sierra was in view. Ellie stood just inside the door, her arms crossed, eyes following Jake more than the dog's. She had a subtle way of watching quiet, calculating, never judgmental. In another life, she might have been a surgeon or a strategist. But she'd chosen this path, patching up broken animals and occasionally broken people. "You're turning into a real writer," she said, stepping out beside him. Jake didn't look up. "Just notes." "Not the way you write them," she replied. "You see things most people miss." He finally turned, half smiling. "I see what matters." Ellie smiled back, then tilted her head toward the building. "You ready?" Jake nodded. "They are." Ellie opened the side door, and a familiar rustling began, small paws tapping against linoleum, yips of excitement echoing down the hallway. Danny, the young volunteer, appeared carrying a small ramp and a leash clipped loosely to Bear's collar. "Easy, big guy," Danny said, breathless from trying to hold the trio back. "You're gonna knock the door down." Bear charged ahead the moment the gate opened, a blur of tan and black with a wagging tail like a helicopter blade. Behind him, Scout darted sideways, immediately drawn to the nearest bush, while Luna paused at the threshold, uncertain. Sierra turned sharply at the commotion, ears lifting, eyes locked. She didn't move at first. like her brain couldn't fully believe what she saw. Bear reached her first. He slowed just before impact and pressed his head into her neck. She lowered her head and licked him once, then again, her body quivering. Scout tackled Bear from the side, but redirected quickly to sniff Sierra's legs, tail wagging furiously. Luna crept forward, then ran. Sierra dropped to her belly, letting them crawl over her one by one. Her tail thudded once, then again, until it wagged continuously. Her eyes shimmered. And Jake, seated only feet away, didn't try to hide his own tears. He had seen war zones, funerals, fire nothing hit like this. Ellie walked over and sat beside him, elbows on knees. "That," she whispered, "is what healing looks like." He nodded. "I almost forgot." They sat in silence as the pups rolled and yipped around their mother, Sierra licking each one, nosing them gently, pausing now and then to just breathe in their scent. Later, Jake would write about it in his notebook. He'd describe the way Sierra had stood protectively in front of Luna when Scout got too rough. He'd write about how Bear had curled beneath her chest and sighed like he'd finally found where he belonged. And at the bottom of the page, he'd write just one word in capital letters: home. The wind shifted over the hills of Ember Trail, sweeping through the dry pine with a voice that seemed to carry the past. Inside Evergreen Rescue, the world felt quieter than usual. The joy of the recent reunion still lingered in the air, but beneath it, beneath the freshly changed bedding and gentle music humming from the speaker above the kennels, there was a tension Jake couldn't quite shake. That morning, he sat in the staff room reviewing paperwork when Mara, one of the weekend volunteers, stepped through the door holding a clipboard in one hand and a small object in the other. Mara was in her early 20s, short with an athletic build and shoulder-length blonde curls usually pulled into a messy bun. She had a sharp wit, a steady hand, and a passion for rescue work that had made her a fast favorite among the staff. Today, however, her brows were furrowed. "Jake," she said, handing him a curved metal tag. "Found this in Sierra's intake file. It was taped to the inner flap of her left ear. Almost missed it. You might want to see the number engraved on it." Jake took the tag, worn and rusted. The imprint was faint, but still legible. CR 621. His jaw tightened. "CR for Kramer?" Mara nodded. "Ran it through the old state registry. Dwight Kramer, backyard breeder, Red Bluff, Oregon. Got flagged a few years ago after complaints from neighbors, but nothing ever stuck. Just warnings." Jake stared at the tag, silent for a long beat. Then he stood. "Thanks, Mara. You did the right thing." She hesitated. "You're not going to do something risky, are you?" "I'm going to do something right," Jake said, pocketing the tag. Later that day, he sat in the front seat of his cruiser, engine idling in the parking lot outside Evergreen. Ellie had asked him to wait. She wanted to talk before he did anything. He almost drove off anyway. Instead, the passenger door opened and Ellie climbed in, her expression guarded. She wore her usual layered knit sweater over scrubs, hair still damp from an early shower. Her voice was calm but firm. "Tell me you're not planning to go out there alone." Jake didn't look at her. "I'm just gathering information." Ellie exhaled. "Jake, you're a good man, but you carry things like they're yours to solve. Sierra's alive. The pups are okay. This man? He's filth. But he's not your burden to carry." Jake turned to her, finally. "He did that to her. Left her out there to die. He walks away, and she almost didn't. You said it yourself, dogs don't lie. She trusts me. So yeah, I am going out there." Ellie looked at him for a long time. "Then promise me you'll do it carefully." Jake gave a short nod. "I will." The next day, under overcast skies, he drove out to Red Bluff, a small rural town with peeling paint and more rust than life. He followed the directions Mara had printed out. The address led him down a cracked road, past scattered trailer homes and empty fields, until he reached a wire-fenced property with a tilted mailbox and a sagging porch. There were no barking dogs now. Just silence. Jake parked down the road and approached on foot. His phone was in his chest pocket, camera rolling. He carried a clipboard with blank forms and a badge on his belt not full-on official, but enough to pass for an inquiry. The door creaked open before he could knock. Dwight Kramer appeared, thick-set and unshaven, with graying hair tied back under a filthy trucker hat. His flannel was unbuttoned and stained, his eyes bloodshot. "You're not with animal control," he muttered. Jake tilted his head. "No, just asking some questions. State's updating past kennel records. We found a dog with one of your tags." Dwight's eyes flicked sharp. "So?" "Tag number CR6721, female German Shepherd, found abandoned near Ember Trail. You remember her?" Dwight grunted. "I've gone through dozens. Can't recall every mutt." Jake's voice remained calm. "She had just given birth. Barely survived. You didn't know she was pregnant?" He stayed only a few minutes longer before turning back, leaving Dwight leaning in the doorway, chuckling to himself. But Jake didn't hear him anymore. His fists clenched as he walked. His boots kicked gravel harder than they needed to. That cold pit in his stomach had returned, something between fury and disgust. Back at Evergreen, he walked straight into Ellie's office and played the recording. She didn't speak until the last word. Then she looked up at him, her eyes steady. "You got him." Jake nodded. "Now I'm turning it in. The DA might not take it, but the pressure's there. And I'll push it if I have to." Ellie stood and placed a hand on his arm. "She fought like hell for those pups. You gave her more than safety, Jake. You gave her justice." Jake looked down at her hand, then toward the room where Sierra slept, her pups curled beside her, no longer shaking from cold or fear. "She gave it to herself," he said quietly. "I just didn't look away." The video was just under 2 minutes long. It began with a grainy shot of a sagging porch in Red Bluff, Oregon, the camera angled from Jake's chest pocket. In the foreground stood Dwight Kramer unshaven, arms folded, voice lazy as he spoke the words that would change everything. "She already gave me 6 good litters. That last one came too early. She was done." A beat of silence, then the line that lit the fire. "That ain't cruelty, that's efficiency." Jake hadn't planned to release it himself. He submitted the clip to the county authorities, handed over his report, and walked away, content that his part was done. But Mara, ever resourceful, had taken it further. She trimmed the video, added subtitles, and sent it to Paws United, one of the country's largest online platforms for animal welfare advocacy. Within hours, the footage was trending under the hashtag #Chachu Justice for Sierra. By the second day, it had amassed over 4 million views. The public outrage was swift and loud. Comments flooded in from across the country: veterinarians, rescue workers, pet lovers, and even retired officers who recognized the dead look in Sierra's eyes before rescue. Celebrities retweeted the video. A state representative shared it with a statement demanding stricter regulation on backyard breeders. Within 48 hours, Dwight Kramer was taken into custody under charges of animal cruelty, illegal breeding, and abandonment. The raid on his property revealed 23 dogs in various stages of neglect, some with open sores, others chained in silence. Volunteers and law enforcement worked side by side to transport the animals to safety, including a German Shepherd missing one eye and a limping border collie with missing fur. The media called it one of the largest rural animal cruelty busts in the state's recent history. Back at Evergreen Rescue, the air buzzed with cautious triumph. The staff moved faster, smiled wider. Ellie, though calm as always, kept a quiet pride in her posture. Jake, however, remained strangely still through it all. He continued his notebook entries, now short, simple observations of Sierra's walks, Scout's new habit of chewing shoelaces, Bear's preference for the sunniest spot in the yard, and Luna's way of looking at the sky like it was asking her something. But fame, as it tends to do, came knocking. A local television station, Channel 8 News, Portland, sent a request for an interview. They wanted to feature Sierra's journey as part of a weekly segment called Guardians of the Forgotten, which highlighted rescue stories with deeper social impact. Jake resisted at first. "I'm not the story," he told Ellie when she showed him the email. "She is." Ellie, seated at her desk with a half-drunk mug of chamomile tea beside her, raised an eyebrow. "Exactly. So let her be. You just stand beside her." The shoot was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. The production crew arrived with minimal fuss, just 2 cameramen, a field reporter, and a gentle-eyed sound technician named Roy, who wore headphones around his neck and offered treats to every dog he passed. The reporter was Nina Brooks, a woman in her late 30s with a slim build, short black curls, and a voice made for quiet urgency. She had that calm, empathetic tone that made people want to answer her questions, no matter how personal. Dressed in a forest green blouse and slacks, Nina spent time greeting Sierra first, kneeling beside her and letting the mother dog sniff her palm before touching her head. "She's calmer than I expected," Nina murmured, gently stroking behind Sierra's ears. "She knows she's safe." The interview took place on the shelter lawn, where the backdrop was simple. A white wooden bench under a leafing tree, Sierra lying beside Jake's feet, her pups playing close by. Bear had grown into his name bigger, stockier, but still slow to rise. Scout chased after a moth with chaotic grace. Luna watched it all, ever observant. The questions were light at first. Jake recounted finding the crate in the woods, the drive back, the fear that Luna wouldn't make it. His voice was steady, but his eyes drifted toward Sierra often. Then Nina leaned forward. "Why do you think people responded so deeply to this story?" Jake paused. "Because she didn't give up," he said simply, "even when everything told her to. People see a dog like Sierra and realize we all carry something. But she carried it for more than just herself. She chose to stay alive for her children. And I think we need stories like that right now." The segment aired that Sunday evening. It opened with slow-motion shots of Sierra running in the yard, her pups trailing her like shadows. Jake's voiceover played atop footage of the forest path, the crate now empty and overgrown. And at the end, the screen faded to black, replaced by white letters. Sierra, a mother, a fighter, a survivor. After the broadcast, Evergreen's phone lines lit up. Donations flowed in. Dozens of families called to ask about adoption, not just for Bear, Scout, or Luna, but for the 23 others rescued from Dwight's kennel. One woman from Montana pledged to foster senior dogs only. A retired K-9 handler sent a box of specialized training toys for German Shepherds. But the most touching moment came days later, when a group of local school children arrived carrying hand-drawn cards. Crayon hearts, floppy-eared portraits, and one note written in careful block letters. "Dear Sierra, thank you for being brave. My mom said you are what hope looks like. I think she is right. Jamie, age 8. Jake hung it above Sierra's kennel. Morning came gently over Ember Trail. The light filtered gold through budding branches, and the air held that rare peace only found in the first hush of spring. Dew clung to the tips of grass along the narrow dirt path behind Evergreen Rescue, the same path where months ago Sierra had been left to die. Now it echoed with the soft padding of paws, 4 sets in rhythm. Sierra in the lead, her tail lifted with quiet confidence, and her 3 pups bounding behind her like sunlight with legs. Jake walked a few steps back, hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket. His beard had grown a bit, the lines at the corners of his eyes had deepened, but something else had softened. He didn't carry himself like a man waiting for the next order. He walked like a man who had chosen to stay. The final checkup had been 2 days earlier. Sierra passed with strong vitals and calm demeanor. The pups Bear, Scout, and Luna had been declared rowdy, healthy, and very opinionated by Ellie with a grin. Jake had filled out the adoption paperwork for Sierra that same afternoon. Steady hands, no hesitation. The plan had been to find good homes for the 3 pups. That had been his intention. He'd even made a list families from the post-interview outreach, people with fenced yards and glowing references. But after the vet visit, as they waited outside Ellie's office, Bear had placed his big paw over Jake's boot and refused to move. Scout had wormed his way under Jake's chair and chewed on the notebook strap dangling from his pocket. Luna had rested her head on his knee and closed her eyes. Ellie had leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "Looks like you've been adopted," she said dryly. Jake hadn't argued. He simply looked down at the 3 pairs of eyes staring back up at him, and nodded. That evening, paperwork was filed, collars were fitted, and a space in Jake's modest home, an old ranger cabin just outside town, was rearranged to make room for crates that would rarely be used and dog beds that would soon be ignored in favor of his couch. Ellie had stopped by that night with a housewarming gift, a handmade name plaque carved from driftwood. It read, "The Bennett Pack, est this year. Now on this walk," Jake glanced to his right. Along the old logging trail, just past the bend, stood a new wooden post simple, weathered but lovingly sanded. The sign attached bore a line he had carved himself with a pocket knife under the porch light 2 nights ago. It read, "Here lies the silence broken by love." Sierra's trail begins. He'd hesitated before writing it. For a long time, the trail had been a place of weight, a scar, but Sierra had changed that. What had once been an end was now, undeniably, a beginning. Scout darted ahead chasing a leaf. Bear stopped to sniff at the base of the sign, then sneezed and looked back as if it had offended him. Luna padded closer to Sierra's side, and the mother nuzzled her gently. It was a small gesture, but one Jake had come to recognize, a check-in, a reassurance, a mother still mothering. They reached the small clearing just beyond the trailhead, where wildflowers had begun to bloom again. Jake sat on a moss-covered stump, watching the 4 of them explore the space that had once nearly taken everything from them. A sound behind him made him turn. Ellie stood there, hands in the pockets of her long cardigan, a reusable coffee tumbler in one hand. Her auburn braid hung loose today, and her expression was softer than usual. "I figured you'd be out here," she said. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Thought you had the morning shift." "I do, but I also know you," she said, handing him the coffee. He took it with a quiet thank you, sipping. It was perfect black, no sugar. She sat beside him without needing invitation. "They look good," she said after a minute. "You look better." Jake gave a small smile. "They keep me honest." Ellie nodded. "That's what family does." They sat in silence for a while. Sierra lay in the grass now, eyes half closed in the sun. Scout wrestled with a stick twice his size. Bear had found something unidentifiable and disgusting, and Luna, as always, watched it all with quiet grace. Jake turned to Ellie. "Do you ever think we end up exactly where we're meant to be?" Ellie looked at him, serious now. "Not always. But sometimes we're given a chance to choose, and that makes all the difference." Jake took another sip of coffee, gaze drifting over his pack, his unexpected, undeserved, utterly perfect pack. "Then I'm glad I chose to stop that day." Ellie placed a hand lightly on his knee, not needing to say anything more. As the sun rose higher, they stayed a little longer, just breathing, just being. And somewhere between the bark of Scout as he charged a butterfly and the gentle sigh of Sierra resting her head in the crook of Bear's belly, the world felt, for a rare and fleeting moment, exactly right. Sometimes miracles don't come with lightning or angels from the sky. Sometimes they arrive on 4 trembling paws, wrapped in mud and silence, still fighting even when the world has given up. Sierra was abandoned, broken, and forgotten, but she chose love over fear. She chose to protect, to endure, to live. And through her story, we're reminded that even in our darkest moments, God sees us. He sends us signs, not always loud, but undeniable. A second chance, a stranger who stops, a home we never expected. In Sierra's journey, we saw more than rescue. We saw grace, healing, and the quiet power of hope. Just like Sierra, you might be carrying a heavy past, but you're not alone. There is always a path back to love, always a trail waiting to begin again. So if this story touched your heart, share it. Leave a comment to let others know they're not alone. And if you believe that every soul deserves a second chance, type Amen in the comments to stand with Sierra and every voiceless creature still waiting for a miracle. Subscribe to our channel to help us bring more stories of love, redemption, and courage into the world. And may God bless you and your family with kindness, healing, and unexpected grace. Let's keep hope alive, one story at a time.
Nobody came to the girl's funeral. The wooden chairs sat empty under the scorching sun, their shadows stretching across the dusty ground like dark fingers pointing toward a simple pine box. Reverend Harlan Briggs stood alone beside the grave, his weathered hands gripping a worn Bible, sweat beading on his forehead as he waited for mourners who would never come. Clementine Shaw had lived on the outskirts of town for 3 years, in a ramshackle cabin that leaned against the wind like a tired old man. Most folks barely knew her name. She kept to herself, trading vegetables from her small garden for supplies at the general store, speaking only when spoken to. Her eyes always downcast. The townspeople saw her as odd, too quiet, too different. When old Doc Miller found her body 2 days ago, collapsed beside her well with an empty water bucket still clutched in her hands, the news spread through town like tumbleweeds in a storm. But instead of sympathy, there were only whispered conversations and shrugged shoulders. Poor thing, they said, but their voices carried no real sorrow. She was just the strange girl who lived alone, and now she was gone. Reverend Briggs had posted notices about the funeral service, hoping someone would show up to pay their respects. He had prepared a sermon about lost sheep and God's love for the forgotten. But as the afternoon sun climbed higher, painting the cemetery in harsh yellow light, he realized he would be speaking to empty air. The Reverend opened his Bible, his voice cracking slightly as he began to read from Psalms. His words echoed across the silent graveyard, bouncing off weathered headstones and settling into the dust. He spoke of mercy and grace, of souls finding peace, though his own heart felt heavy with the injustice of it all. A young life had ended, and nobody cared enough to witness her final farewell. Just as he was about to close the service, something caught his eye in the distance. A familiar brown shape was moving slowly down the dirt path that led to the cemetery. Tobias, Clementine's old donkey, was walking toward them with his characteristic stubborn gait. The animal had been missing since they found Clementine's body, and everyone assumed he had wandered off into the wilderness. But as Tobias got closer, Reverend Briggs noticed something strange. The donkey was dragging something in his mouth, something that looked like a small leather pouch, worn and stained with dirt. The animal's eyes held an unusual urgency, as if he understood exactly where he needed to be and what he needed to do. Tobias stopped directly beside Clementine's grave, his breath coming in short puffs as he carefully placed the leather pouch on the freshly turned earth. The Reverend stared in amazement, watching as the faithful animal nudged the pouch closer to the simple wooden cross that marked his mistress's final resting place. Reverend Briggs knelt down slowly, his knees protesting against the hard ground. The leather pouch was old and cracked, tied shut with a piece of frayed rope. It felt heavier than expected when he picked it up, and he could hear something shifting inside, like coins or small metal objects rattling together. His fingers trembled slightly as he worked to untie the knot, wondering what Clementine had kept hidden away. Inside the pouch, wrapped in a piece of faded cloth, were dozens of silver coins. Not just any coins, but Mexican pesos and American silver dollars, some dating back decades. There had to be enough money to buy half the buildings in town. But that wasn't what made the Reverend's breath catch in his throat. Underneath the coins was a small, carefully folded piece of paper. He unfolded the paper with trembling hands, squinting to read the faded ink in the bright sunlight. It was a list, written in Clementine's careful handwriting with names and amounts carefully recorded. The Henley family, $5 for medicine when their baby was sick. Mrs. Patterson, $3 for flour during the harsh winter. Old Pete the blacksmith, $7 for his granddaughter's shoes. The list went on and on, page after page of anonymous gifts that Clementine had given to nearly every family in town over the past 3 years. She had been secretly helping her neighbors through their hardest times, always careful to make sure they never knew where the money came from. The total amount was staggering, representing years of careful saving and selfless giving. At the bottom of the final page, in slightly different ink, was a note dated just 1 week ago. If something happens to me, please make sure everyone knows that I never forgot how the town took me in after the fever took my family. I wanted to give back what I could, even if I couldn't find the courage to do it face to face. Tell them I was grateful for the chance to help. Reverend Briggs felt tears welling up in his eyes as he read the words again. All this time, while the townspeople had dismissed Clementine as a strange, unfriendly girl, she had been watching over them like a guardian angel. She had sacrificed her own comfort to ease their burdens, asking for nothing in return except the satisfaction of knowing she had helped. Tobias stood patiently beside the grave, his intelligent eyes seeming to understand the weight of what had just been revealed. The donkey had known where to find this hidden treasure, and he had known exactly when to bring it forward. Now the truth about Clementine Shaw could finally be told. But something else was troubling the Reverend as he stared at the pile of remaining coins. If Clementine had been so generous with her money, giving away small amounts to help others, where had all this wealth come from in the first place? And why had she chosen to live in poverty while sitting on what amounted to a small fortune? Reverend Briggs carefully folded the paper and placed it back in the leather pouch, his mind racing with questions that demanded answers. He looked down at Tobias, who was now lying beside the grave with his head resting on his front legs, as if keeping vigil over his departed mistress. The sight of such loyalty broke something loose in the Reverend's chest. "Come on, old boy," he said softly, patting the donkey's neck. "We need to get to town. People need to know about this." The walk back to town felt longer than usual, with Tobias following close behind like a faithful shadow. Reverend Briggs clutched the leather pouch tightly, feeling the weight of its contents and the even heavier burden of truth it contained. He thought about all the times he had seen Clementine in town, how she had always seemed nervous around people, how she had hurried through her errands with her head down. Now he understood why. She hadn't been unfriendly or strange. She had been watching, listening, learning who needed help and figuring out how to provide it without drawing attention to herself. Every trip to the general store had been a reconnaissance mission. Every quiet conversation an opportunity to gather information about her neighbors' struggles. When they reached the main street, several townspeople stopped to stare at the unusual sight of the Reverend walking with Clementine's donkey. Bertie Jones stepped out of her boarding house, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression curious but cautious. "Reverend Briggs," she called out. "How did the service go? I'm sorry I couldn't make it, but we had guests checking in and—" Her voice trailed off as she noticed the leather pouch in his hands and the strange intensity in his eyes. Other people began to gather, drawn by the uncommon sight of the town preacher looking so shaken. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the bakery, flour still dusting her sleeves. The Henley family appeared from the general store, their 3 children clustering around their parents' legs. "I need to tell you all something," Reverend Briggs announced, his voice carrying across the street. "Something about Clementine Shaw that you need to hear." He held up the leather pouch, and the afternoon sun caught the worn leather, making it gleam like old gold. Tobias brought this to her grave. It was hidden away, waiting for the right moment to be found. And what's inside? It changes everything we thought we knew about that girl. Old Pete the blacksmith hobbled over from his shop, his hammer still in his hand, metal shavings clinging to his leather apron. "What are you talking about, Reverend? What could that poor child have had that would matter to anyone?" Reverend Briggs reached into the pouch and pulled out the folded papers, his hands trembling slightly. She kept records, detailed records of every family in this town she helped over the past 3 years, every dollar she gave, every kindness she showed, every burden she tried to ease. The crowd fell silent, faces shifting from curiosity to confusion to something approaching dread. Mrs. Patterson took a step forward, her expression growing pale. "What do you mean, helped us?" "I mean," the Reverend said, unfolding the first page, "that when your husband broke his leg last winter and you couldn't afford to keep the bakery open, it wasn't a lucky customer who left those $5 silver on your counter. It was Clementine." Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "That's impossible," she whispered. She never said anything. How could she afford?" Reverend Briggs continued reading from the list, his voice growing stronger with each revelation. "The Henley family, $7 for medicine when little Sarah had the fever. Mr. Collins, $4 for seed when the drought killed your first planting. Mrs. Morrison, $6 for winter coal when your husband was laid up." One by one, the faces in the crowd changed as recognition dawned. People began to remember those mysterious moments when help had appeared just when they needed it most. Anonymous donations left in their shops, money found tucked under doors, supplies that appeared without explanation during their darkest hours. "But how?" Pete the blacksmith asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "She lived in that broken-down cabin. She wore the same dress every time she came to town. Where did she get the money?" Bertie Jones stepped forward, her face flushed with shame and understanding. "I knew her before," she said quietly. "Before she moved to that cabin. 3 years ago, when the fever swept through the valley. It took her whole family, her parents, her 2 brothers, everyone. But they weren't poor folks, not originally." The crowd pressed closer, hanging on every word. Bertie's voice grew steadier as she continued. "Her father was Samuel Shaw. He owned the big ranch up north, the one that got sold off after he died. Clementine inherited everything, but she couldn't bear to stay where her family had lived. So she sold it all and came here with just her donkey and enough money to last a lifetime. But instead of living comfortable," Reverend Briggs added, holding up more pages from the pouch, "she chose to live poor so she could help others. She watched every family in this town, learned your struggles, and found ways to ease your burdens without you ever knowing it was her." Mrs. Henley began to cry, remembering the night she had prayed desperately for money to buy medicine for her sick daughter. The next morning, the exact amount she needed had been sitting on her windowsill, wrapped in brown paper with no note or explanation. "We treated her like she was nobody," Mr. Collins said, his voice thick with regret. "We barely spoke to her. Some of us even crossed the street to avoid talking to her. She saved my granddaughter's life," Pete whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "When I couldn't afford the doctor, somehow the money appeared. I thought it was a miracle." Reverend Briggs felt the weight of the moment settling over the gathered crowd like a heavy blanket. "It was a miracle," he said softly, "just not the kind you thought. Clementine Shaw was our miracle, and we were too blind to see it." Tobias had been standing quietly during the entire revelation, but now he moved closer to the group, his intelligent eyes seeming to survey each face as if measuring their understanding. The donkey had carried more than just a leather pouch to that grave. He had carried the truth about a girl who had loved her community so much that she had given everything to help them, even when they gave her nothing in return. But the most devastating truth was still to come, written on the final page that Reverend Briggs had not yet read aloud. Reverend Briggs turned to the final page of Clementine's records, his hands shaking as he read the last entry. The date was written in trembling handwriting, clearly composed during her final days. The crowd had grown silent, sensing that something even more profound was about to be revealed. "Listen to this," the Reverend said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This was written just days before she died." He cleared his throat and began to read. "I know my time is short. The sickness that took my family has finally found me too. I can feel it in my chest, growing stronger each day. But I am not afraid to die. I am only afraid that people will think I was strange or unfriendly." Mrs. Patterson let out a soft sob, covering her face with her hands. The weight of their collective guilt was becoming unbearable as they realized how wrong they had been about the girl who had given them so much. The Reverend continued reading. "I wanted to help everyone because this town gave me a place to start over when I had nothing left but grief. You may not have known it, but every smile, every nod, every simple greeting meant more to me than the money I gave away. I was so lonely after losing my family. And even though I was too shy to make real friends, knowing that I was helping people made me feel like I belonged somewhere again." Bertie Jones stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "I remember now," she said, her voice breaking. "The day she first came to town, she looked so lost, so broken. I should have done more. I should have tried harder to make her feel welcome. We all should have," Mr. Collins added, his voice heavy with regret. "Instead, we let her live like a hermit while she was secretly taking care of all of us." Reverend Briggs held up his hand for silence as he reached the most devastating part of Clementine's final message. "I saved the last of my money for something special. In the tin box under my floorboards, there is enough to build a proper schoolhouse for the children. I know the old one leaks when it rains, and the children deserve better. Please use it for them. They are the future of this town, and they should have every chance to learn and grow." The crowd stood in stunned silence as the full magnitude of Clementine's generosity sank in. Even in death, even after being ignored and dismissed by the very people she had helped, she was still thinking of ways to make their lives better. "There's more," the Reverend said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I also leave Tobias to whoever will love him. He has been my truest friend through these lonely years. He is gentle and smart, and he understands more than most people realize. Please don't let him end up alone like I did." At the mention of his name, Tobias lifted his head and looked directly at the gathered crowd. His dark eyes seemed to hold a depth of understanding that made several people step back in amazement. The donkey had not just brought them a leather pouch, he had brought them a mirror that reflected their own failures and shortcomings. Old Pete stepped forward, his weathered hand extended toward Tobias. "Come here, boy," he said softly. "You'll never be alone again. I promise you that." But as the crowd began to disperse, each person carrying the weight of their newfound knowledge, Reverend Briggs noticed something troubling. The tin box Clementine had mentioned was nowhere to be found. Someone would need to search her cabin, but more importantly, they needed to understand exactly how she had died and why no one had checked on her during her final illness. The mystery of Clementine Shaw was far from over, and the truth about her final days might reveal even more about the character of both the girl and the town that had failed her. The next morning, Reverend Briggs led a small group to Clementine's abandoned cabin, including Bertie Jones, the Henley family, and Pete the blacksmith, who had insisted on bringing Tobias along. The donkey seemed eager to return home, trotting ahead of the group as they walked the dusty path to the outskirts of town. The cabin looked even more dilapidated in the harsh morning light. The roof sagged in the middle, several boards were missing from the walls, and the front steps had partially collapsed. It was hard to believe that someone had chosen to live in such conditions while possessing the means to build a mansion. "She could have fixed this place up," Mr. Henley said quietly. "She could have lived in comfort. But then she wouldn't have had money to help the rest of us," his wife replied, understanding dawning in her voice. "She chose to live like this so we could live better." Inside the cabin, they found the sparse belongings of a woman who had deliberately embraced poverty: a single wooden chair, a small table, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, and little else. But Pete, following Tobias's insistent nudging, found the loose floorboard that concealed the tin box. The container was heavy, filled with gold coins and paper money that represented more wealth than most of the townspeople had ever seen in one place. But underneath the money was something even more valuable: a collection of letters that Clementine had written but never sent. Bertie picked up the first letter with trembling hands. It was addressed to Mrs. Patterson and dated from 2 years ago. "Dear Mrs. Patterson," she read aloud, "I wanted to thank you for always being kind when I came to buy bread. Your smile was often the only bright spot in my entire week. I hope you don't mind that I left some money to help with your husband's medical bills. I know what it's like to watch someone you love suffer and feel helpless to do anything about it." Letter after letter revealed the same pattern. Clementine had written to nearly everyone in town, expressing gratitude for small kindnesses, explaining her anonymous gifts, and sharing the loneliness that had consumed her daily life. Each letter was signed with the same message: "With love from your grateful neighbor Clementine Shaw." "She wanted to connect with us, Mrs. Oh," Henley whispered, tears falling onto the paper in her hands. "She wanted to be part of our community, but she was too afraid to try." In the final letter, addressed to the whole town and dated just 3 days before her death, Clementine had written, "I am getting sicker and I know I don't have much time left. I keep hoping someone will come to check on me, but I understand why they don't. I never gave anyone a reason to care. I was so afraid of being hurt again after losing my family that I pushed everyone away, even when all I wanted was to belong." The letter continued, "If you are reading this, it means I died alone, which is what I deserved for being too cowardly to reach out when I had the chance. But please don't blame yourselves. I made the choice to live in isolation. I just hope that someday, someone will remember that I tried to help, even if I didn't know how to ask for help in return." Reverend Briggs folded the letter carefully, his heart breaking for the lonely girl who had given everything to a community that had barely acknowledged her existence. "She did reach out," he said quietly, "through her generosity, through her kindness, through every dollar she gave. We just weren't listening." Tobias had wandered to the corner of the cabin where Clementine's bed sat, and he lay down on the floor beside it, his head resting on his front legs. The faithful animal seemed to understand that his mistress would never return, but he was determined to honor her memory by staying close to the place where she had spent her final days. The group stood in the humble cabin, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived in service to others, and realized they had been given a chance to make things right. Word spread through town like wildfire as people learned the truth about Clementine Shaw. Within hours, every family had gathered to discuss what they had discovered about the girl who had lived among them like a guardian they never knew they had. The shame was overwhelming, but so was the determination to honor her memory properly. Mrs. Patterson was the first to act. She closed her bakery early and spent the afternoon baking fresh bread, which she brought to Clementine's grave along with wildflowers from her garden. "I should have brought you bread when you were alive," she whispered to the simple wooden cross. "I should have invited you to sit and talk." The Henley family arrived next, carrying a handmade quilt that Mrs. Henley had stayed up all night completing. "For the girl who kept our daughter alive," she said, spreading the colorful fabric over the grave. Their children, who had never met Clementine, placed hand-picked flowers around the headstone. By evening, the cemetery had been transformed. Every family in town had brought something to honor the girl they had ignored in life. Candles flickered in the growing darkness, casting warm light over an impromptu memorial that should have happened 3 days earlier. Old Pete had crafted a beautiful wooden marker to replace the simple cross carved with the words, "Clementine Shaw, beloved friend and guardian angel of our community." Reverend Briggs stood before the gathered crowd, the same people who had failed to attend the original funeral. This time the wooden chairs were filled, and many more people stood respectfully around the grave. Tobias lay beside the headstone, finally at peace knowing his mistress was properly honored. "We are here tonight," the Reverend began, his voice carrying across the silent cemetery, "not just to mourn the death of Clementine Shaw, but to celebrate a life that touched every one of us in ways we never understood. She taught us that true generosity requires no recognition, that real love asks for nothing in return, and that the most profound kindness often comes from the most unexpected places." He held up the tin box they had found beneath her floorboards. "Clementine left us more than money. She left us a challenge to be better than we were, to notice the lonely among us, to reach out to those who seem different or distant. She left us the opportunity to learn from our mistakes and create a community worthy of her sacrifice." Bertie Jones stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "I propose we use Clementine's money exactly as she wished. We'll build that schoolhouse, and we'll make sure every child in this town knows the story of the girl who gave everything so they could have a better future." The crowd murmured their agreement, But Mr. Collins raised his hand. "More than that," he said. "We should establish something permanent. A fund to help families in need. Manage the way Clementine would have wanted it, quietly with dignity, making sure no one ever has to suffer alone again. The Clementine Shaw Memorial Fund," Mrs. Henley suggested, "for anyone who needs help but doesn't know how to ask for it." As the night grew deeper, people began sharing stories about the mysterious acts of kindness they had received over the past 3 years. Each tale revealed another layer of Clementine's secret mission to care for her community. She had somehow known exactly when each family was struggling and had found ways to help without embarrassing them or making them feel like charity cases. "She was watching over us," Pete said quietly, his hand resting gently on Tobias's neck. "All this time we thought she was strange and unfriendly, but she was actually studying us, learning our needs, figuring out how to make our lives better." The memorial service continued well into the night, with people taking turns reading from Clementine's unsent letters and sharing their regrets about not reaching out to her when she was alive. But gradually, the focus shifted from grief to determination. They couldn't change the past, but they could ensure that no one in their community would ever again die alone and unnoticed. 3 months later, the new Clementine Shaw Memorial Schoolhouse stood at the heart of town, its bright red roof and sturdy walls a testament to one girl's final gift to the community. Children's laughter echoed from its windows, and carved above the entrance were the words, "Built with love by Clementine Shaw. May all who enter here find knowledge and kindness." The Clementine Shaw Memorial Fund had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Every family in town contributed what they could, and word had spread to neighboring communities about the girl who had loved so deeply that she had given everything to help others. Donations arrived from strangers who were inspired by her story, and the fund now helped families throughout the entire valley. But perhaps the most profound change was in the people themselves. Mrs. Patterson had started a tradition of bringing fresh bread to newcomers in town. The Henley family opened their home every Sunday for community meals, making sure no one ate alone. Pete the blacksmith had become the unofficial keeper of Tobias, but the wise old donkey had become everyone's friend, wandering freely through town and somehow always knowing when someone needed comfort. Reverend Briggs had established a weekly tradition of reading one of Clementine's unsent letters during Sunday service, reminding the congregation that kindness often comes from unexpected sources and that everyone deserves to be seen and valued. The letters had taught them to look beyond surface impressions and to reach out to those who seemed distant or different. On this particular morning, a young family arrived in town with their belongings packed in a weathered wagon. They looked tired, dusty, and uncertain about their welcome in this new place. But before they could even stop their horses, Mrs. Patterson emerged from her bakery with fresh bread. Bertie Jones appeared with offers of clean rooms at her boarding house. The Henley children ran forward with wildflowers and bright smiles. "Welcome to our town," Reverend Briggs said, approaching the confused but grateful family. "We've learned that strangers are just friends we haven't met yet." The newcomers looked amazed at such immediate kindness from people they had never seen before. "We didn't expect such a warm welcome," the father said, his voice thick with emotion. "We've been traveling for weeks in most places." He trailed off, not wanting to complain about less hospitable communities. "Things are different here," Pete explained, walking over with Tobias at his side. "We learned some hard lessons about the importance of taking care of each other. A wise girl taught us that a community is only as strong as its kindness to strangers." As the family was welcomed into their new home, Reverend Briggs walked slowly to the cemetery. Clementine's grave was always decorated with fresh flowers now, and someone had built a small bench where people could sit and reflect. The simple headstone had been replaced with a beautiful marble marker that read, "Clementine Shaw, she taught us how to love." Tobias often spent his afternoons at the grave, and today was no exception. The old donkey looked up as the Reverend approached, his eyes holding that same intelligent awareness that had amazed everyone the day he brought the leather pouch to the funeral. "She did it, didn't she, old friend?" Reverend Briggs said, settling onto the bench. "She changed this whole town, even in death, maybe especially in death." The Reverend pulled out his worn Bible and read aloud from Clementine's favorite psalm, the one he had read at her lonely funeral 3 months ago. But this time the words carried different meaning. This time they were spoken in a community that had learned to see beyond appearances, to value quiet kindness over loud declarations, and to ensure that no one would ever again die unknown and unmourned. As the sun set over the thriving town, Painting the sky in brilliant colors, Tobias rested his head against the marble headstone. Clementine Shaw had finally received the recognition she deserved. But more importantly, her legacy lived on in every act of kindness, every outstretched hand, and every stranger welcomed home. The girl who had died alone had taught an entire community how to live together. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the Old West, where courage and compassion collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.